Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you here as our special guests and for you to be present for this Catholic-Jewish dialogue meeting. I want to just kind of set the framework for today's meeting a bit. This morning, there was some interreligious dialogue among Orthodox rabbis and some Catholic leaders, including faculty and religious leaders, on some interesting themes in Catholic-Jewish relations. And so this afternoon's lectures are tied to some of those themes that we studied this morning together. It's a continuation of study, really. There's been some study in the morning, and now we're studying together in the afternoon. So thank you for coming to these sessions. The theme for today, you may have noticed that the gift and the calling of God are irrevocable, is a theme that emerges out of a 2015 Vatican document that was published on the anniversary of what is referred to as Nostra Aetate, the Second Vatican Council's declaration on the Church's relationship to non-Christian religions. And in that very famous document, Nostra Aetate, published in 1965, the Church restated in a very positive way its relationship with not only Judaism, but also the other world religions. This document has created quite a framework of positive relations among the Catholic Church and other world religions. And so we're here today kind of in a way as a consequence of that Second Vatican Council development. And in 2015, this document that I referred to, the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, this Vatican document updated the Catholic Church with reflections on where we now stand with regard to this document. But more importantly, one of the things it did is it called for more intense theological dialogue. More intense theological dialogue. So in 2015, the Catholic Church articulated this need for a more intense, more focused theological dialogue. We're trying to answer that call today by gathering together and thinking through, reflecting theologically on the relationship between the Church and Rabbinic Judaism. So we're doing that today with very special guests who are here for us to help guide us. And I want to go ahead and turn now and cut to the chase and introduce you to the first scholar who will speak today, who will give a lecture. And then following that lecture, our other scholar will respond and create kind of a nice opportunity to discuss and have some questions. I want to introduce you today to my colleague, Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill. Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill is the Cooperman Ross Endowed Chair for Jewish Christian Studies at Seton Hall University, where he teaches Jewish studies in the graduate program. He is the author of Thinking God, the Mysticism of Rabbi Zadok of Lublin. He is also the author of Judaism and Other Religions, Models of Understanding. And he is the author of Judaism and World Religions, a book that was published in 2012. Dr. Brill just completed another book, tentatively titled Rabbi on the Ganges, A Jewish-Hindu Encounter. He is active in Jewish interfaith encounter with Catholics, Muslims, and Hindus. Would you please join me in welcoming Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and see the lovely St. Leo's campus. It's certainly warmer than when I'm coming down home. I think we went up 40 degrees of temperature coming here. Jewish tradition paints Moses as a lawgiver, that the law was given on Sinai. And Judaism identifies itself as a life of Torah, a life of following God's ways. The ethics of the fathers start off, Moses received the Torah from Sinai, gave it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, and then from there to the men of the Great Assembly. And they would say, be cautious in judgment, establish many pupils, and make a safety fence around the Torah. Jewish view of its own self is as an educating community, teaching. The model of a rabbi is a sage, not a priest. The goal is to learn how to make proper judgments. And the goal is to apply it to the community. Or Shammai would say, make Torah study a permanent fixture of your life. It's a life of studying Torah and living Torah. What it's not is a lot of the very Christian concepts of covenant, grace, salvation. It's just not the way Jews speak or rabbinic texts speak. Now, 18 years ago, there was a major innovation that Pope John Paul II was the first pope to visit a synagogue since Peter. The first pope to recognize Judaism as an ongoing, on-living presence that didn't stop with Christianity. Immediate responses by various Catholic groups were to come up with this idea of a two-covenant theory. The Catholic theologian John Palikowski in America, the French bishops in Europe, said there's going to be, can we think about a two-covenant theory, a covenant through Moses and a covenant through Christ. However, later that year, Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict, said no. A proper Catholic understanding is that there's got to be one covenant. And if you're going to understand the relationship as a Catholic to Judaism, it's got to be under a single rubric. So the question becomes, now what? How do you formulate that view of Judaism and Torah under a Catholic rubric? Now, the first major statement actually came out 2 years ago, a little over a year ago, called Covenant Salvation, The Gifts and the Calling of God Are Irrevocable, a reflection of theological questions pertaining to Catholic-Jewish relations on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. So my talk today is going to be rather Vatican-centered, Holy See-centered on this document, but from a Jewish point of view. And my question is being, what does it show from a Jewish reader? Will help you understand where the differences still lie. I didn't expect there to be copies on the table, because I actually just crossed off last night the references to the document saying, I didn't want to confuse everyone by saying, oh, in paragraph 26. Didn't expect that. So we're going to deal with what's in the document. And 3 months ago, the authors of the document were in Beersheba in Israel answering questions. Questions to a group that didn't really know what was, didn't follow all of this. And we're going to then go and deal with how did the questions get answered there. And then conclude with where I see things are going. So as I said, in December 2015, the Vatican Commission on Religious Relations with Jews issued this major document, The Gifts and the Calling of God Are Irreversible. Most of the global media coverage basically reduced it to a few talking points. Oh, there's nothing new. Oh, there's no active mission to Jews anymore. Or somehow Jews are mysteriously accepted by Christ, but mysteriously we don't know how. I'm going to step back at that and show you some better things in the documents. First of all, one of the biggest innovations of this document is that they spent 2.5 years writing it together with rabbis and Jewish scholars. You don't have church documents being written in the presence of non-Catholics with advice. That's an incredible change to hear the Jewish point of view. And when it was released, Jews were at the podium, giving their own comments and responses. Another point in the last 15 years, when Pope John Paul II visited the state of Israel, he was the first pope to recognize the state of Israel. And the first one, as I said, to recognize an ongoing Jewish community. In the last, now 18 years, most of the College of Cardinals have Jewish friends. They email, they write, they go to conferences, they listen in, they visited the state of Israel. People don't realize that Pope Benedict had been to Israel 4 times before becoming Pope. And just the endless of almost anyone who's papal is now has friends and emails regularly. That is an incredible change, because I can now, something can come out and I can shoot it, because of interfaith events, I'll have their private emails. I can then shoot an email and say, why did you write this? And everybody's going to each other's interfaith events, Holocaust remembrance events, community events. And no longer is it two sides that don't know each other. Everybody's reading each other's books, sending their students and disciples to each other's graduate schools. So now you have Catholics studying Jewish theology in graduate school, and you have Jews studying Catholic theology. It was rare, but I'm an Orthodox rabbi with a doctorate in Catholic theology. That made no sense a little while ago. And now there are Catholic priests who have doctorates in Talmud. That's a major change. Everybody reads each other's op-eds. Now, the document that we're talking about in 2015, even though it took over 2 years to write, actually got born in the 1990s, when a younger generation started, at that point they were older, they were already mature, started writing articles on the topic. So it's really, in many ways, a culmination of a 25-year process in which a certain group of figures started thinking a certain way, and this is the document that reflects their thinking. Historically, this is the first document that now takes into account the scholarship on Second Temple Judaism or intertestamental period. And the document shows influence both in books and personal conversations with figures that can name drop Daniel Boyarin, Peter Schaeffer, Larry Schiffman, and a host of scholars re-embedding Christianity within a Jewish Second Temple context. It wasn't that long ago when most European scholarship said, of course, Jesus had nothing to do with his Jewish context. He was some sort of Galilean who had nothing to do with Judaism. The very fact of a document that takes it for granted that he's part of grew out of a Jewish milieu is important. And important for this document, in addition, is a funny document from 2001, which people didn't know how important it was going to turn out to be, issued by the Pontifical Biblical Commission under Cardinal Ratzinger, in which he said, very quickly, that Judaism is parallel to Christianity, worthy of study and respect, that there are spiritual treasures within it. But beyond that, already in 2001, the document said, that the Jewish reading of the Bible is a possible one in continuity with the Jewish scriptures of the Second Temple period. A reading analogous to Christian reading which developed in parallel fashion. The 2001 document then said both readings are bound up with a vision of their respective faiths, of which the readings are the result and expression. Consequently, both faiths are irreducible. Now that was seen as a quirky document in 2001. No one expected it's going to be now a call for the Holy See to invest huge amount of time to understand the Jews as a parallel tract, a parallel understanding of the Bible, and a parallel understanding of some very similar theological terms. The document also clearly shows what's called the scholarship of the new Paul, in which Paul is no longer portrayed as rejecting and damning Judaism, but is now working through an idea of what does it mean to be saved for the Jews and what does it mean for the Gentiles, that he wasn't damning Judaism. document takes full effect of that. And as I said before, this was a really 25-year document. Its grounding is in a group of theologians, conservative theologians, centered around the Journal Concilium, which includes, besides Cardinal Ratzinger, it includes Cardinal Casper, and the annotated edition of the 2015 document is all Cardinal Casper from this. Maybe if someone had asked me, I would have added from some others. But it's all Cardinal Casper. But at the same time, if I can find passages in the 2015 that reflect the Catholic theologian Balthasar and a number of other important Catholic theologians whose voices are in the background. But as it is, most of this document is the thinking of Cardinal Walter Casper, who had written a series of documents already for almost 15 years going in this direction, and even in 2010, Casper, writing as a cardinal theologian, already has a document for the God's Gifts and the Call are Irrevocable 5 years before this one. And Cardinal Casper had already said that the church didn't see what Paul was saying for 2 millennium, and therefore the goal of the Catholic Church is to return to the original meaning. Besides Cardinal Casper, you have the writings of Pope Benedict as Cardinal Ratzinger, who put out 2 volumes on the life of Jesus, which actually recontextualized Jesus as Jewish against the background of Second Temple, Qumran, Sadducees, apocalyptic literature, which was incredibly important. Cardinal Ratzinger said the anti-Judaism of the patristic period is not the way to read the New Testament or early Judaism. And that Catholicism should see itself most strikingly as a continuity of the priestly ritual and monarch elements within Judaism, and therefore the church should turn back to Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, of which Jews are the preservers of a great deal of how to read that material properly. I can jump ahead a second, and Cardinal Ouliet of Quebec, a protege of Cardinal Ratzinger, actually has a commentary on this, on Cardinal Ratzinger, saying that Cardinal Ratzinger's goal was to go back to closer to Jewish readings, the typology of the Church Fathers, as being a closer read of what the text meant. There was a clear directive to reject by name the old German Lutheran scholars of figures like Adolf von Harnack, who paint a radical discontinuity between Judaism and Christianity. They are the ones that they're going to regularly say they're Marcionism. They're saying that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, doesn't count anymore, is incorrect. And all these documents say no, it's important. And once again, as I said, one of the names that aren't footnoted in there is the importance of Hans Urs Balthasar, another leading conservative Catholic theologian, who said we learn from Judaism not the covenantal who of God, but the what, the quality, how to express justice, kindness, charity, peace that we see in the stories of the Hebrew Scripture, and how the Jews read it in a non-typological way, meaning to read it for actually what the story says about how one human being relates to another human being. And therefore, one should read more of that interpretation. With that background, I'm going to turn to the document itself and point out several issues that remain within the document from my Jewish reading after all that praise. The first one, and this is a statement that I made at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago, and I'm surprised I got reaction from the audience as I was saying something new, is that Jews and Catholics use the word covenant differently. For a Catholic, the world is devoid of God's redeeming presence until he redeems himself, until he reveals himself. And only those who are included in the covenant can know God. Jews, on the other hand, assume there's some sort of universal natural knowledge of God to all people through Adam and Noah. And Jews usually, when they use the word covenant, refer to circumcision, the study of Torah, the Sabbath, or Jewish peoplehood. So you have a certain miscross of words. So there'll be many points in this document where, from a Catholic theological point of view, it'll say Jews and Catholics share the covenant, but at the same time, that's a Catholic theological statement. Jews don't even understand it unless you're going to say, okay, let's sit down and learn Torah together, or let's keep the Sabbath together. There is that fundamental, when you read it, that gap. Now to more specific points. First, the idea of the document assumes a special theological status of the Jewish-Catholic dialogue. The document assumes Jews have, in the same 25 years, moved from being an outsider religion to slowly moving inside to being part of Christian ecumenicism. The same offices, the same people who write this document are the same people who are writing Catholic Lutheran, Catholic Anglican, Catholic Evangelical. It has moved theologically under the people of the Bible, so Jews are another one, maybe a little thornier, maybe a lot less thornier than dealing with evangelicals or Lutherans, but it's no longer a separate religion. And the Catholic Church will consider Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism as outside the covenant. On the other hand, Jews don't have a special, from Jewish theological point of view, there is nothing in Judaism that singles out Christianity because God is available to all. You know, Jewish texts will speak about anybody, anywhere in the earth. I mean, Jews will almost always quote Malachi 1:11, that anywhere they call in the name of the God and they praise me, I am there for them. So you've got a dissimilarity between the Jewish point of view and this document, as much as it's an incredible step forward. Another point of view that's going to be different is this document almost always looks to Second Temple Judaism, meaning the years 200 before the Common Era, 100 before the Common Era, and the first century. The world of the book of Daniel, the world of Qumran, the world of Sadducees, and saying, look, here is Christianity in a Jewish context. But on the other hand, Jews are a religion that have now been around for 2,000 years after that. And a lot of that saying, look, we share what you were in 100 before the Common Era, becomes a little disjarring to Jewish ears. For example, saying we share the same ideas of kingdom of God. Well, yes, in the year 20, we probably did. But at this point, Jews see the kingdom of God much more as affirming in one's daily life God as king in one's wholeheartedness. And it's a slightly different meaning. Well, the most glaring one in this document, certainly glaring from a Jewish point of view, and that's why I started talking about Moses. The document says, in Jesus, not a few Jews of his time saw the coming of a new Moses, the promised Christ, but his coming nevertheless provoked a drama with consequences still felt today. The document, 2015 document, sees Moses as a savior, bringing God's saving grace to the world and performing miracles as a proto-Christ. Jews forever see Moses as a lawgiver, as giving over the oral law, and as creating a covenant between God and the Jewish people. It's not the same. Now, actually, the idea that you would have a new Moses goes back to an obscure little book from before the Common Era called Pseudo-Philo that says that Samuel will be a new Moses because he's going to bring the people together. The problem is, unless you're an academic, you've never heard of this book, Pseudo-Philo. And it's not something to say, oh, let's get together and read Pseudo-Philo together. In fact, I'm not even sure how many libraries have a copy of it. But it's saying, yes, the document went out of its way to show Christianity, Jesus, Paul, Peter grew out of books like Pseudo-Philo. But at the same time, it leaves us at a funny point. It leaves us at the year 0. But beyond that, what it doesn't address, and if we're going forward, is how already by the end of the 1st century, Moses takes on a very different role. To give you both the Jewish case and then the gospel, Jews hold the oral law is not in heaven, but is now worked out in the debates of the rabbis. The very famous story, 2 rabbis were debating. One rabbi says, but heaven will prove that I'm right. The other side says, no, Torah is not in heaven. We don't pay attention to divine voices since Mount Sinai. We live in a world in which you don't appeal to heaven anymore. On the other hand, the Gospels clearly see the direction and what to do clearly coming directly from heaven via Jesus. So, for example, Mark 7:5. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why do your disciples not live according to the traditions of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? Answer, you have to let go, answer of the disciples to the Pharisees, you have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to the traditions of men. And he said to them, you have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. The idea that law comes from God, or law comes from this legal process of interpreting texts, becomes elided in the document when you say things like it's the new Moses giving law, because when you unpack it in the next sentences in the document, Jews say, okay, let's open up the text. Let's learn how to be judicious in understanding them. The rabbis will sit around and tell you what it means and apply it. While here there's a very strong sense that there's a heavenly divine message that you're appealing to directly, not to the words of men. As I mentioned before, the problem of letting everyone into the covenant or not, the lack of parallelism between where Catholic position is that Jews are in the covenant now, and the Jewish position that doesn't understand that. Already in 1995, the Anglican church historian Linwood Urbane, in his History of Christian Thought, now this is already 1990s, already post-Vatican II, not the Holy See, not the Vatican, but an ordinary professor, an ordinary Don, writing a book of Christian thought, in his very first chapter, writes, Judaism was universal in the 1st century and saw God as Lord of all things, of all people and all nations, and part of the innovation of Christianity was thinking you needed salvation through Christ. The document did not get there yet. And now recently there is a New Testament scholar in America, Larry Hurtado, who puts out a book about every 18 months at this point, showing you the innovations of Christianity. And one of the most important innovations is that Christianity, early Christians, restricted access to God through Jesus as Christ, not as a universal, the Jewish universal anymore. Meaning, Larry Hurtado points out that when it says you shall have no other gods before me, Jews meant that you Jews, I took you out from Egypt, you can't have any other gods before me, but I'm not saying anything about the rest of the world. The Christian reading of the Ten Commandments has always been, nobody should have any other gods or religions before Christ. It's different, and this document has yet to get to dealing with that. Now the important thing about the importance is this document took out supersessionism and replacement theology, and that's the striking, notable thing that people quote from it. The goal was to take out replacement theology, the fact that Christianity has replaced Judaism. But the way it's done, because there can't be two tracks anymore, and it can't be that Jews are secretly following Christ. The way it is now is that Jews and Catholics share their origin in Abraham. And it's not supersessional. It's not that Christianity, it goes beyond Judaism, because we were both there in Abraham. That the faith of the Jews and the faith of the Christians is really one Abrahamic faith. That's the way this document solved the problem of how to bring Jews into the covenant. Not by saying they're already in covenant through Christ, or there's some fulfillment they don't know about, but that already the faith of Abraham already brought the salvation to the world. It was revealed to humanity through Abraham, and then played itself out in two different ways through Judaism and Christianity. But once again, Jews don't focus on Abraham that way. Now, these are a lot of questions to point out. The document also points out how Jews follow Torah the way Christians hold Christ, and Jews get salvation through studying Torah, while Christians get salvation through Christ, because both of them were already there in Abraham. Once again, Jews still don't look at it that way. Am I overly bothered by it? Less than you may think, because as somebody who reads Vatican documents, if you read the Vatican document, for example, on babies who die without baptism, do they go to limbo? The church in 2007 said they don't go to limbo anymore. How do you make sense of it now? The church throws up its arms and say it's a mystery that we're going to work out in the next coming decades. Meaning there's so many church documents created by this same group, nothing to do with Catholics or Jews, but on basic Catholic tenets that went through revisions through Cardinal Ratzinger, through Cardinal Casper and others, that it becomes fundamentally they brought Catholic theology to a certain place, leaving it to the next generation to go forward. And there's all sorts of academics who now write their articles about how to go forward, but that doesn't become church doctrine, but it becomes the opening of where to go forward. The document actually even ends up quoting the Talmud directly, saying that both Judaism and Christianity, it's about walking in the ways of God, imitating God's attributes, and that both of them are about healing the sick, alleviating poverty and human suffering, and there's a commonality toward the ethics of both. Okay. Now, I don't know if that was satisfying to you, but less than 3 months ago, in Beersheba in Israel, Ben-Gurion University, there was a 2-day conference, morning to night, in which the author of it, Cardinal Koch, with a number of others like Norbert Hoffman, sat there answering everybody's questions in various forms, theologians, rabbis, historians. And they asked, does this make sense? That the religions are so different. And so Cardinal Koch writes, what is covenantal community? What is covenantal continuity? It aims to counter those who see 2 parallel paths of salvation. No, there's only one path of salvation. But what does this do for Jewish readings of the way of Torah, which are so different from the Christian ones? Christians turn to Christ, and they say it was already there in Abraham. Isn't that a contradiction to the way Jews read Abraham and Moses? And Cardinal Koch just answers, this is a divine mystery. This document was to create questions, to set an agenda, go forward, have conferences, work on it. But it was to set a new framework for going forward, was the answer that he gave. He also answered saying that now we Christians can pray your prayers, we can go to your service, you are part of our communion, so to speak. And it says, we both share the same image of God. But Cardinal Koch answered about this document, he's not naive. We're not ignoring differences, there are great differences. I pointed out a few, the differences remain. But we're all looking forward to what Franz Rosenzweig quotes in Zechariah, that in the end of days all will be one, but until that time Judaism and Christianity will be different. And that's where he left it. So as a conclusion, I must point out I'm coming from Seton Hall University in New Jersey, which founded the very first Center of Jewish Christian Studies back in 1953. The first place in the world to give courses on things like the Jewish background of Eucharistic prayer, the metaphors of salvation, the role of Psalms, the role of biblical patriarchs in both traditions. And this was more than a decade before Vatican II. The courses were given, graduate students attended them, people were shaped, consciousnesses were formed. This document was written by people who attended Vatican II, but spent their 1990s and 21st century as senior scholars writing it. And I look forward to people who are now in graduate school or young academics. They're the ones who are going to take this document forward, understand where the differences are, and then slowly work them out. It's part of a long process, like Cardinal Koch says. Overall, I find it a firm commitment to moving forward, to more study, to obligation to including Judaism in seminary formation of clergy, and to greater familiarity between the faiths. Looking at this document from the vantage of 1965, or even of 1998, it's quite a worthy document.
I now want to welcome Dr. Valkenberg up to give just some brief comments as a response to Dr. Brill, and then we could open it up to questions you might have. So if you're thinking of something right now about something you heard that you have a question, this document is certainly meant to provoke questions. So please jot those down if you have anything, and then we can turn to that Q&A session after Dr. Valkenberg.
Yeah, and I'll be very brief because I realize I have some time later. So I would like to know 2 points on which I agree with Dr. Brill, and 2 points that, for me, open up the floor for discussion. So the first point that I agree with wholeheartedly is thinking about this strange thing that for the Vatican, the dialogue with Jews has a different status than the dialogue with other religions. As he said, the dialogue with the Jews has a special committee or commission under the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity. The other religions are under the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. Now, you can see, coming from a Catholic point of view, and I would support that Christianity has a different relation with Judaism as it has with other religions. So in that sense, I agree with that. On the other hand, as someone working with interreligious dialogue, my big concern is, do we really do justice to the otherness of Judaism as a different religion from Christianity? And I think this pops up many times in every debate. So let me give you one example of something that I recently noticed, and I will come back to it this afternoon as well. So Christians who discover the value of Judaism for their own theology tend to assimilate Judaism into their own form of Christianity. A famous example is all these pastors who are organizing seders. And they are usually saying, well, this is very good for Jewish-Christian dialogue, and it might be, but it might also mean that you just take back Judaism as a period in your own Christian history. So a good Jewish friend of mine said, well, I'm always a little bit afraid that Christians will ask me to love them. I want to be their good friend, but I don't want to love them, because that's a different type of relationship. If we can be good friends, that's good enough for me. So this speaks to me to the same idea of, okay, we have this special relationship, but can we also do justice to Judaism as a separate religion? And then the second point, this separate religion continues after Christ. So that was also a point that Dr. Brill made. And again, let me give you one example in my own practice. I worked with a book for a long time in my own courses of world religions. We both teach world religions. I had a book by a Father Eugene Gorski, a Holy Cross priest, it's Theology of World Religions. And it's a great book. I loved using it. It had one problem. It discussed Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in one chapter. And you can see what happened. He began with Judaism, then he came to Christ, he went on with Christianity until he came to Islam. And then, of course, the entire context of the book had a Christian context. So Christianity came back, but Judaism never came back after Christ. So that's a form of replacement theology that I think is still very often there in our forms of theology, and also in the document to a certain extent. Okay, my 2 questions. I think the most interesting question for me would be, you refer to all these German theologians, Cardinal Kasper, Hans-Urs von Balthasar, Joseph Ratzinger, and I can see how I'm Dutch, almost German, in a European context. So I can see where that comes from, why they find that important. At the same time, it is true that the large majority of Jews live in the United States and in Israel, of course. And I do know that many people look at the Jewish Catholic dialogue in the United States as kind of an exemplary dialogue. So my question is, where are the American voices, the American Catholic voices in this discussion? Is it all German still? That would surprise me. So that's one question. And then the other question is about Abraham. I spent some time in my life writing about Abrahamic relationships, and I got some feedback in which I noticed that, generally speaking, the Jewish partners in this trialogue, if you want to call that, I don't like the term, but okay, the relation between the 3 religions, generally speaking, they are not so fond of this term Abrahamic relationships. And I think you gave kind of an example of that. So could you tell a bit more about why you think that might not be the best type of relationship? That's my 2 questions.
Which one of them?
Oh, yeah.
These are good questions. We go around.
So, the first one about America, the role of America. The dialogue has been wonderful in America. The now 40-something centers of Jewish-Christian relations, Jewish-Catholic relations in America have done great work, everywhere from St. Leo's all the way up to Boston College, from Seton Hall all the way to Loyola in Los Angeles. They've all done incredibly great work. They were very important in drafting documents like the 1985 Guidelines on the Teaching of Judaism and Catholicism. However, this gets into politics of the church, is that most of the people involved in drafting theology for the Holy See now are coming from the German-speaking world. We have moved, people who could have been or were more American-centered writing in the 80s have been slightly sidestepped by this other group. And as it points to this real conscious differences between them, which used to be played out in various journals back in the 1990s. And so therefore these people are still now academics, running the centers, writing great theology, but at the same time they're having to take a step back politically, where Father John Palikowski immediately gets out there and writes a theology of two covenants, but now in light of the magisterium took a step back and said, well, maybe I'm not going to push for that, I'm going to follow the magisterium. There's a very clear sense of what went on, and that's the first one. The Abrahamic Jews are not comfortable with Abrahamic faiths because the idea of faith of Abraham from Galatians, or the Quranic Abraham as the first Muslim, the first believer, are in those two faiths. Jews don't have those sort of statements. For Jews, Abraham is somebody who has to go through various tests, who then winds up being the father of the Jewish people, and it culminates in Moses. There's the liturgy, the thinking, there's no point that it stops in Abraham. So it's an uncomfortable sort of place because the Judaism doesn't define itself that way. You could just as well say Judaism could have picked out a dozen other biblical figures other than Abraham, which is a greater role in Catholicism and Islam. Okay, now take questions.
When one looks at post-World War II, post-Holocaust era, and you start to see the emergence of the State of Israel, and you start to see the socioeconomic and political effects of a Jewish state on the rest of the world, knowing that the Vatican is very sensitive to what goes on globally, I was wondering if that was part of or a factor in Vatican II emergence.
Okay, so if you're asking about the 1960s, the answer is actually not yet. The Vatican did not even recognize the State of Israel, and Pope Paul didn't even visit the State of Israel. He visited Christian holy sites. In the 1950s, there was clearly a sense of a metanoia, a turning to God, saying no to reintegrating the Jewish people, to reintegrate Jewish people back right into Christianity. And there's clearly moments on the way where Jules Isaac said, look, here are the passages. Here are the passages against Judaism that are in the Christian tradition. Then when Father Ted Flannery wrote The Anguish of the Jews, bringing all this material into the Catholic Church, it became moments of momentum, starting with the Seelberg Conference in 1947 of Catholics and Protestants realizing there's some problem. Anti-Judaism could lead to a Holocaust. But the State of Israel really was not on their consciousness yet. It was a new country. It was up there with Myanmar and other former British colonies. It didn't have that same weighing presence at that time. However, by the 1992, the Holy See and the State of Israel signed an accord. And then it becomes a slow process of working that through. And then Pope John Paul II was the first pope to visit the State of Israel. And now it becomes part of formation. And so therefore it's a bigger issue now in the 21st century to play a role. And now you have something you never heard before. You now have Catholic theologies of the State of Israel. Cardinal Martine has a book on Jerusalem that has never been translated into English, but is in all the European languages on Jerusalem. Cardinal Schönborn has a few essays on that direction. There's now Catholic forms of a theology of the land for Jews, and now it's one of the issues for the future.
Dr. Brill, I had a few questions. If you don't mind my joining in and asking a question, I was wondering about this notion of kind of, it seemed to me, your reading of Christianity's covenant in the past has been that it is almost, in a sense, closed toward others. And yet, at the same time, you have this patristic tradition, the early church fathers emphasizing the idea of an implicit faith possible through the other religions, that that if they are unknowing of the explicit knowledge of Christ, but yet in their striving and understanding of what they see as true, have this sort of kind of implicit connection to Christ. And that's, of course, one kind of universalism that's present that would maybe characterize the tradition in a more open way.
So the answer is those become resources. They're part of resourcement. You could now say that Origen can be used. You can say seminal ideas in Jerome could be used. You could look to St. Francis in Islam. There are lots of places to turn to get resources. But if I'm coming off of the doctrinal and theological statements since the Counter-Reformation, you are not going to find those playing a role. So yes, as a resourcement, as a Catholic theologian, those are wonderful things to play a role. And I'm willing to go into dialogue as we talk about the resources in Thomas Aquinas. There's many of those because he had a much more positive view of Judaism than people generally think. And we can all teach that in our sort of comparative scholasticism, where you compare Maimonides to Aquinas, his Rabbi Moses, to what he thinks is the Jewish view versus the Catholic view. But they haven't played a role in recent years. And part of this forward is saying, okay, let's go back to those, and I would say for Catholic to create a Catholic theology for them.
And thank you very much, that's helpful. And I have one other question about, and feel free if anyone has questions to raise your hand, let me know. You had mentioned this notion of questions in the document, this theme of it setting forth questions and almost like an agenda for study for Jews and Christians for the future. And so I'm wondering about, and you also seem to think that that was a unique theme, or that it was something that was important about the document, and in addition that the document was presented and written by Jews and Catholics dialing together, so almost like a partnership.
Right.
Could you perhaps maybe fill us in, why is that important in the context of Christian history, how group study has been viewed in the past?
You said a whole bunch of questions there, but certainly talking about things in presence of the other. You don't have a bunch of men speaking about women's issues today. You don't have a bunch of only whites speaking about Afro-American issues today. It is just not seen as the way you have dialogue and understanding issues and working through them. And so therefore the fact that this document went out of its way and took more than a year longer because people had to meet and conference and talk things through, and doing it in the presence of the other, that you couldn't make any sentence that seems absurd to the other's point of view, is incredibly important. But if we talk about the principles of dialogue, this was a dialogical document of being done in the presence of the other and working through, and that's why it was left in the form of questions. I mean, if you look at the very first page, it says this is not yet a magisterial document. It is not a binding document yet. We're still working this through, but this is our definitive point. We know we have to move on in life, and also, unfortunately, not everyone here is that young, is it's time to move on in life, and may it spawn future documents and future discussion, but this was really the dialogical, in the presence of the other, to understand the other, to get back to what the real issues are from the other side.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think I read when you look at the struggle in early Christianity, first century, until we get to Constantinople, you see Paul and Peter early on in that portion, that struggling with the definition of Christianity as in practice,
Right.
and so on. And I was wondering if Paul's voice was lessened and Peter had a stronger voice. Would we see a different kind of Christianity?
We would have definitely seen anything that's coming more Peter, less Augustinian, would have been a very different church. More Hebraic Jerome. And there are many routes you could have gone that could have led to a different outcome. But that's not what happened. So part of this is saying that there was potential for other realms, and now to go back and look at them.
Well, I'm wondering if that is sort of in a background to what is happening today, the construct of progress. I'll use the word progress, and understanding.
On one hand, it's true. You're saying I agree with you, but this document is deeply Pauline, deeply letter to the Romans. Cardinal Casper, that became the pillar of which he was going to open it up, and his proteges are following that Pauline direction. They've taken full advantage of the new studies of Paul, making him not anti-Judaism, but they're not going into other places. As noted, the one thing the document does note is that they're not using letter to the Hebrews. They're not using that for theology, and that is noted because that is seen as too restrictive, not creating enough role for Judaism, and that's the contours they left.
Yes, please, Mark.
You mentioned your concern regarding a common Abrahamic appeal. I didn't get that so much out of the reading as I did the accent upon word, whether it be Torah, whether it be logos.
Well, that was his question. His question.
Okay.
I was answering his question on Abrahamic base. It wasn't actually. I didn't actually focus on that. But the Abrahamic becomes that point of commonality.
I guess my question would be, it seems like the contemporary conversation is trying to come up with some type of common point of conversation in terms of a salvific animus.
Yes.
And if Abraham is not it, and we want to avoid...
Abraham is taken as it for the meantime.
And I guess what I'm asking is there, from a Jewish perspective,
Yeah.
because like people like Dupuy and others have written from a logos,
Right.
Christocentric word. From a Jewish perspective, is there energy in Torah's word or
As
Devar? Is that a...
Okay, so since you bring up Jacques, I can run with that. Know that this crowd was not fond of him, to put it mildly. To put it mildly, meaning they called him up and questioned his credentials. So far be it for me to tell this group that you should go listen to him. However, that is clearly a valid way to go. A logocentric way would be a completely different way. It would also open it up to a bigger form of other religions. Because as of now, if you go back to Nostra Aetate, it doesn't even say that Muslims share biblical stories with Christians. It say they associate themselves with the stories of the Bible, but not that they were actually given to them by God on any level. It's very finely parsed to avoid any revelation to Islam. If you went Dr. Bray's direction, it opens up huge. For those who don't know, he was a theologian of Asia, to try to do dialogue with Asian religions. He had a whole theory of reaching out through the logos. You see the logos in Asian religions, Hinduism, Buddhism. He was then called into the magisterium for heresy. There's even a book published about the case, which gets assigned in many college campuses. Why is Jacques Dupre under the Inquisition?
Bill Burrows.
What?
Bill Burrows.
So there's lots of other directions to go in, but I was commenting on this document.
Well, I guess what I saw in 23, 24, 25 is heavy word-based coming out. It's a soteriological framework of conversation around words. And it was a constituent part of what we're looking at. So, particularly 23, 24, 25, it's very pregnant.
No, I actually have the full quotes here. Don't worry. It's very centered around it, but if you look very closely, and this is part of the things I skipped over, it really makes Torah, if you look closely, as pre-existing before the world, quoting Genesis Rabbah. Makes it into a pre-existing logos that is already predetermined as part of the divine. And that becomes not a logos active in the world, but one that is already for all eternity determined that Judaism has Torah as part of God, not a logos working in the world that can apply to Hinduism or Buddhism. They went out of their way to avoid that reading.
We have time for one more question. Yes, please. Oh.
Really fascinating. I'm just curious if there are. Thank you for this. It's been fascinating. I'm just curious if there are Protestant organizations' involvement in this kind of dialogue. If there are certain denominations or organizations that you know of that are open to or this kind of active in this level of interfaith dialogue at the scholarly level, or is it in a different way?
Give the story for those who. After Nostra Aetate came out, a decade later, you're going to find the Lutherans had a similar reckoning, and followed by, and I forgot the order, Disciples of Christ, and Methodists, and most of that material of the 70s, 80s is online. They put it up on websites. Come the 21st century, you then have each of them starting this theological dialogue and now making statements. You know, there are several volumes of Lutheran theology working forward that was originally pushed by Bishop Kristen Stendhal, who was from Sweden, who pushed it forward, but also Franklin Sherman and others. But what's new is since you can actually find on YouTube an interesting TV discussion with Pat Robinson. There was a point where Pat Robinson actually said something that was already about Jews that was seen as inappropriate by the 21st century, which then opened up a huge dialogue. And now there is actually a Center of Jewish-Christian Relations at Liberty University. There's actually, I think, 3 evangelical centers. There's 40-something Catholic ones. There's now, I think, three evangelical ones. I think there's one in Oral Roberts out in Oklahoma. And they are actually, their conferences focus, I know Oral Roberts had one recently with Jewish, theological, and evangelical, focusing on the Holy Spirit. and the total of the Holy Spirit. It becomes a very different sound if there's a specific group you want to know about, but it doesn't have the same, it has a huge amount of implications in America, but Catholic German theologians can raise things theologically to a different level, to put it mildly. However, for example, there's a whole bunch of Pentecostals that now believe in the two covenant theory, a Mosaic covenant for Jews and a Christ covenant for Christians. And that was exactly what Cardinal Ratzinger said not to do, but no, that's growing in America. There's all sorts of centers and figures through Texas and Oklahoma that are having events pushing the two covenant theory.
Friends, would you please join me in thanking Dr. Brill? Time now before the next lecture, just for a 5-minute coffee break. There's coffee in the back with brownies and cookies, so feel free to dig in. We'll see you back here in about 5 minutes. Okay, it's my pleasure to move us into the next part of our